In this video, I'll discuss the intentionally terrible counterpoint in Mozart's K522 Divertimento entitled Ein Musikalischer Spaß, traditionally translated as a musical joke, but perhaps more accurately translated as some musical fun. I'm publishing this on my favorite holiday, April Fool's Day, so I thought this topic would be appropriate. Although the real Mozart probably bore little resemblance to the shrieking caricature portrayed by the movie Amadeus, we know from his letters that he had a robust sense of humor, and we know from his compositions that he had an equally robust musical sense of humor. This piece is a parody of what an inept composer might have produced, and it's riddled with hilariously awkward passages. I will first share a highlight from each of the first three movements, and then the majority of the video will be a detailed analysis of the presto finale, famous among other things for its amateurish fugal passages. The piece is scored for 4 string parts and 2 horns, a combination that was common for divertimenti at the time. For example, 3 of Mozart's earlier divertimenti have this same instrumentation. The first movement opens with this purposefully trite, overconfident theme. Notice when the theme repeats that its first and last measures are identical, allowing them to overlap, creating an amusingly unbalanced 7-measure phrase. In a musical era known for its symmetrical phrasing, Haydn and Mozart often use this kind of asymmetrical phrasing for comedic purposes. For another example, listen to the opening theme of Haydn's Opus 20 No. 3 Quartet that also consists of 7 measures. Now returning to Mozart, my favorite passage from this first movement is the end of the recapitulation section, when the second theme returns. Notice the clumsiness of this final measure, partly due to these parallel fifths between the first violins and violas. That of course also exists between the first violins and the bass. This introduces an entertaining passage with no real melody other than this obviously accompanimental Alberti bass configuration, played by the first violins, a prolonged trill that also seems out of place played by the violas, and this clunky repetitive descending bass line that becomes even more awkward in this portion that has a doubled leading tone that doesn't resolve, and combines with this new ridiculous viola passage and the Alberti bass figure. Shortly after this, the horns play this silly outburst of rapid-fire notes, followed by the closing theme of the movement, accompanied by this absurdly nonsensical bass line. The most noteworthy gag from the Minuet and Trio second movement is this slapstick horn passage containing these obviously wrong notes. In Mozart's time, the horn had no valves, and besides stopped notes, was limited to notes of the harmonic series. To partially solve this problem, they used different lengths of interchangeable tubing called crooks to play more easily in different keys. This is why orchestral scores from this era notate the horn parts without a key signature as a transposing instrument in the key of the composition. This slapstick horn passage is thought to simulate what would happen if an ill-prepared horn player mistakenly attached the wrong crook. The most famous joke from the slow third movement is the ending of the violin cadenza, when the upward major scales suddenly become a whole tone scale at the very end, followed by this unexpected pizzicato note and this strange trill between two non-adjacent notes. The real musical fun in this piece occurs in the presto finale that opens with this theme. Part of what makes the theme so amusing and catchy is again the irregular phrasing, with the overall theme lasting 10 measures divided into phrases of 4, 4, and 2. Compare this with another quirky 10-measure theme from the finale of Haydn's 66th Symphony in B-flat, in this case divided into equal 5-measure phrases. The Mozart finale now continues with a capricious, immediate modulation to a statement of the theme in the flat mediant key of A-flat major, before abruptly jumping back to F major as if to say, never mind. Immediate modulations to the flat mediant are not common in Mozart's music, but one other instance that comes to mind is the non-satirical version of this same modulation, occurring at the beginning of his A major K464 quartet. It starts with the first theme in A major, immediately modulates to a false second theme in the flat mediant key of C major, and then modulates to the actual second theme in the expected dominant key of E major. Notice the perfection of the 4-part imitation in the first modulation, and more importantly, just notice the overall compositional skill that Mozart displays at the height of his non-satirical compositional ability. Remember, this is one of the 6 quartets he dedicated to Haydn, all of which he said were the fruit of a long and laborious endeavor. Now comes the much anticipated fugato based on this sophomoric subject. This section reminds me of a funny comparison of Handel and J.S. Bach, attributed to Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, that says, "Handel's fugues are good, but he often abandons a voice. Bach's clavier fugues can be set out for as many instruments as they have voices. No voice fails to receive its proper share, and every one is carried through properly. I doubt whether Handel's fugues will ever bear comparison with Bach's." I haven't yet done a video about Handel's music, but I certainly consider him a great composer, and I don't completely agree with this assessment, but it is definitely true that his contrapuntal writing is generally more sparse. Returning to Mozart's Fugato, the quote about Handel is a perfect description of the counterpoint seen here. In skillful fugal writing, the contrapuntal lines are as independent as possible, and static moments from one voice are complemented by motion from another. The first countersubject of this Fugato is not really much of anything other than two notes that are completely subordinate and accompanimental to the subject, and the last of which even doubles the subject. The second countersubject is only slightly more substantial and seems more like a standard bassline accompaniment. Suddenly, these two countersubjects drop out completely and are replaced by this third, pitiable countersubject, consisting of just one repeated note and a trill. Notice also that Mozart intentionally commits the harmonic faux pas of doubling the third of the triad, adding to the clumsiness of this passage. Next comes an absurd passage featuring a very long trill marked piano, played by both horns. As I mentioned before, horns in Mozart's era had no valves, so trills could only be accomplished by moving the jaw, lips, and tongue, a difficult technique known as a lip trill. Good horn players were certainly capable of this, which is why there are many trills, for example, in Mozart's own horn concerti, but this particular trill imposes the added difficulty of having to play quietly for 9 straight measures, almost guaranteeing a clumsy sound. Under the trill, the violins give us the semblance of imitative counterpoint, but notice that the overlapping portions have identical rhythm and melodic contour, meaning that one is basically just the accompaniment of the other. Since the dark blue motif is just a decorated version of the green motif, it also doesn't really add any substance to the counterpoint. This new yellow trill motif, combined with the dark blue motif from earlier, now alternates with this new green motif combined with a new pink countermotif that completely lacks any independence or contrapuntal relevance. Despite this, Mozart still subjects the pink motif to contrapuntal manipulation, with the pink and green motifs trading places in invertible counterpoint. I'm labeling the green motif Alleluia because it reminds me of the famous final movement of his K-165 motet. Now listen first to the Alleluia theme from the motet, and then compare it with this passage. One of my favorite platitudes now occurs when this descending passage played by the violins is immediately repeated verbatim, but this time playing each note twice in a perfect parody of an unskilled composer's attempt to create variety. The section now ends with this silly closing theme combined with a clunky and unimaginative accompaniment. The main theme now returns in the dominant key of C major, leading to another juvenile passage in which the ending portion of the theme enters imitatively, followed by imitative entries of its inversion, followed by this red passage that gradually grinds to an almost complete halt before a surprising forte outburst brings us to the F major recap of the main theme. Mozart's musical humor was strongly influenced by Haydn, who was the master of humorous musical devices. For example, the silly imitation and inverted imitation from the passage we just heard is remarkably similar to this passage from the finale of Haydn's Opus 33 No. 3 Quartet in C major. The red portion that humorously lulled us into a false sense of security and then surprised us with a loud outburst reminds me of a similar passage from the opening movement of Haydn's 60th Symphony in C, nicknamed Il Distratto, or The Absent-Minded Man, because it was originally incidental music for a play with that title. The passage in question is marked perdendosi, meaning losing oneself, and it dies away in a similar manner before the surprising loud outburst. This Haydn symphony also has a moment in its final sixth movement that resembles Mozart's wrong notes from the horn that I discussed earlier. In this case, the energetic presto finale screeches to a halt and the violins suddenly start tuning their strings, with the score directing them to tune the G string from F to G. Once everyone is in tune, the remainder of the presto finale continues as if nothing had occurred. Now listen to Mozart's recapitulation section, noticing this hilarious moment when all the strings suddenly double each other. Also pay attention to the return of the horn trill, this time even more ridiculous because they play 2 octaves apart at opposite extremes of register. Finally, notice that the green Alleluia motif is combined with the pink countermotif in invertible counterpoint, but this time the pink motif itself is inverted, in addition to the inversion of its position in the score. coda section now begins with the main orange theme that Mozart now treats with a contrapuntal device of its own, known as imitation per arsen et thesen, which means in this case that the original entry is on the weak beat and the answering entry is on the strong beat. I have an entire video dedicated to this topic, in which I call the technique irregularly metrically shifted counterpoint. The horns now play the main theme, accompanied only by sparse pizzicato notes from the bass, leading to the final and possibly most famous gag of the entire piece, an early example of polytonality, during which the horns are the only instrument remaining in F major, and each of the remaining parts plays a cadence in a different key. Now listen to the entire coda section of Mozart's April Fool's Day masterpiece.